Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for today's webinar on nuclear power in Saskatchewan. My name is Adam Brome, and I'm an administrative coordinator with SARM. And we're going to start off today's webinar with a brief introduction to the Adobe Connect platform. We will then transition into the main presentations, followed by a Q&A session. This webinar will be recorded, and a copy of that recording will be available on our website under the webinars page following today's session. To maximize your audio and video during today's webinar, please ensure you are either joining through a Google Chrome or the Adobe Connect platform. The chat box is located on the right side of the webinar window and is visible to all webinar participants and facilitators. You can use this to connect with other attendees, bring any technical difficulties to the speaker's attention for troubleshooting, or to provide any other comments and/or feedback. There is a dedicated question and answer box labeled Q&A, which is located right underneath the chat box. This is where you can submit any questions that you may have regarding the webinar content throughout today's session. Please do not submit any questions through the chat box. There will be polling questions to answer throughout today's presentations. Please simply just click on your answer and read the live results as they come in. There are copies of today's presentations available for download during the Q&A portion of the session next to the chat box. Please let me know in the chat if you are unable to download these files, and I will email them to you directly.
Says my microphone is connected.
And I hear right. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties during today's event, please notify us in the chat box, and we'll do our best to troubleshoot. And I will now hand it over to Leanne Jarocki from SaskPower, who will be moderating today's session.
I think it just needed a reboot. Well, I did it once before and it didn't work, but maybe it did work this time.
Good morning, everybody.
Should I try it with my headset or not?
Ray, we can hear you.
Okay, but I still can't hear them, and that's the word.
Oh,
Sorry,
he can't hear us. Okay. Sorry. We'd love it for Ray to join in with us today. So I'm just going to do a quick land acknowledgement here. First of all, I just want to say how happy we are to be here today. Although I'm going to be completely honest, we would much rather be with you in person. One of the things that I find, we all find here at SaskPower so valuable about engaging with folks across rural Saskatchewan is actually making the drive, seeing the landscape, coming out to your communities, sitting down in the restaurants, having coffee, talking with people directly. So it's not the same thing doing this virtually, but we're doing what we can for now, given the environment we're in. So we appreciate your patience, and we know technology doesn't always work smoothly. We're doing everything we can to get information into your hands and collect some feedback in this world that we're in right now. So I'm here in Regina, which is home of the Treaty 4 Nations and also the Métis. And we acknowledge this at SaskPower in the spirit of reconciliation, which is, hugely important and something that we're thinking about all the time at SaskPower. But more importantly, when we're talking about planning the power system and building energy projects. So opportunities there for Indigenous participation and economic reconciliation. I just want to start with a quick safety moment. I know here in Regina, when I drive to work, I drive through school zones. School zones are obviously all over the province, and teachers and kids are much more distracted these days than ever. So just a reminder to keep our kids safe and slow down in those school zones. And then I do want to invite Ray to offer some welcome remarks, but I just wanted to set the stage for, why we're here today. We've shared some information in the past, I think at a higher level about, our plans to get to net zero. Iain will talk a little bit about, how important a reliable, sustainable supply of electricity is to all of us in Saskatchewan. It's some of the things that we're doing to achieve that. Today, we want to provide some information about the small modular reactor project we're advancing, the planning phase that's moving forward, because while we're still at a fairly early stage, it's really important to SaskPower that we provide information and, more importantly, seek feedback and input on how we're planning this project, and specifically how we're planning our engagement. We're looking for some advice from leaders in rural Saskatchewan for, how we enter rural Saskatchewan when we start to do our community engagement, which will be, we think, sometime in the spring of 2022. But certainly before we start that kind of formal siting process, we're looking to collect some feedback and input from you and your communities on what kinds of things are important to you. We want to build understanding of what we're doing, but more importantly, we really want to build understanding on our side of what matters to you. And I circulated some questions out. I think they might have come from Adam or from Amy or from Laurel, about things that you're gonna that we want to ask you later on in the presentation about your perspectives on small modular reactors, what you want to know more about, and some feedback on some of the early siting criteria that Iain's going to talk about a little bit later. So but before we get into that, I wanted to invite Ray, if technology is working okay, President Ray Orb, to deliver a couple of welcome remarks. And thanks very much for being here today, Ray.
Good morning. Thanks to SaskPower for hosting this webinar today. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm having some technical difficulties today in rural Saskatchewan. But thanks to all of you for attending to learn more about nuclear power and small nuclear reactors. So I really appreciate stakeholders like SaskPower reaching out to RMs early on with initiatives like SMRs are being explored. This would be a great forum to engage in some proactive discussion and ask questions and find out more about the potential of this new technology. I hope RMs enjoy this engagement opportunity and look forward to learning more about SMRs today through the presentation and discussion. This would be a great forum to engage in some proactive discussion and ask questions and find out more about the potential of this great technology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ray. Appreciate that. So Adam, if you want to maybe just take down my presentation or our presentation and pop up George's. We have with us today as well George Christidis, who is the Vice President of Government Relations and International Affairs from the Canadian Nuclear Association. George is joining us from Ottawa. So he has a significant amount of experience in the nuclear industry. He's actually an employee of Ontario Power Generation, which gets 60% of their electricity from nuclear power, and he is now seconded over to the CNA. But the most important thing you need to know about George is that he was born and raised in Regina, Saskatchewan, and that he graduated from the U of R. So he is one of our Ottawa contacts who has still got those really, really healthy Saskatchewan roots. So it's nice when we go to visit George that we can still talk about down home Saskatchewan stuff. So George, take it away.
Hear me okay? One
Yes.
moment.
Yeah.
You can hear me okay? Good. Well, thanks, Leanne, for that warm welcome, and I really appreciate the opportunity. And still consider Regina home. A lot of family and friends are still very connected with Regina. So thank you for this opportunity. So let's start the conversation a little bit about the opportunity from a Canadian nuclear perspective and the Canada's nuclear landscape that may engender the conversations that are occurring in the province and may assist folks in as we move forward. So maybe we can move to the next slide and start. We are the Canadian Nuclear Association. We're the voice of the nuclear industry. We have about 100 members, and just to highlight some of our membership from Saskatchewan, SaskPower and Cameco and the Fedoric Center are part of our members, and we really represent the voice of the industry, or the position of the industry vis-a-vis the federal government, international stakeholders. We engender conversations with universities, really aimed at sort of educating, or at least sharing our knowledge on how nuclear is an important feature of the economy and society in Canada and beyond. And maybe just to start off with some numbers here in terms of nuclear energy in Canada. Obviously, from a Saskatchewan perspective, Saskatchewan is already a strong nuclear player with the uranium industry that's based in Saskatchewan, number 2 in the world in terms of uranium production. Canada's got its electricity in total comes up about 15% comes from nuclear. In Ontario, we have 60% of the energy grid that is nuclear. And in Ontario, it really was the nuclear capability that enabled the transition from other sources, particularly from coal. So from the Ontario perspective, nuclear provided that opportunity for the province to really get off coal and engender a cleaning or reduction of the carbon on the grid. In New Brunswick, 36% of the electricity grid comes from nuclear. And one of the benefits that the nuclear industry does generate beyond the electricity is obviously the creation of isotopes, which are very essential in terms of the medical nuclear medicine sector. We have a rich history in the nuclear industry. Canada has a very strong nuclear ecosystem. Obviously, the discussion of late is around small modular reactors and sort of future opportunities. But a lot of the capability of Canada's nuclear expertise is based on the current nuclear operations and the solid supply chain that exists, and the experiences in terms of the refurbishment of recently, particularly in Ontario, which is about a $26 billion initiative, which is on time and on budget as OPG and Bruce Power are proceeding with the refurbishments of their nuclear fleet in Ontario. In terms of small modular reactors, and what they represent, they really represent sort of the next stage or next evolution of the technology. There are different technologies that are involved in terms of what's defined as smaller reactors. But in this instance, Canada really is in a position to be a leader, a first mover in this space. We're sort of seeing the creation of a new market as it relates to SMRs, or small modular reactors. And they are an evolution in the technology that could provide multiple opportunities for jurisdictions that are looking at reducing their emissions on grid, but also for resource development sectors to reduce their emissions in the production, or industries for that matter, in heavy industry that are looking for other sources of clean steam and heat. In Canada, there are multiple markets where SMRs could be applicable. And again, the size of those small modular reactors will vary according to the potential markets. But you have the on-grid opportunity, and those are for existing utilities that might be looking at reducing their emissions on grid, mining operations or resource development, which are looking for heat for resource development. And there is an opportunity for rural, remote northern communities to have access to SMR technology that could assist them to reducing emissions, and in many instances get off of diesel. And that is an exciting opportunity for those communities as well. The work that we've been doing as an industry collectively and working with industry and governments was really the development of the SMR, small modular reactor roadmap, and the SMR action plan. It was an extensive engagement, talking with industry, talking with federal government talking with other governments, Saskatchewan governments, representatives, communities, Indigenous communities, Northern communities in instances, and collecting an engagement and ideas and having discussions that led to about 50 recommendations that were generated that really speak to the opportunity on moving forward with the SMR opportunity. And it really highlighted the need for an opportunity to engage more with communities. But there was a high level of interest and need that was identified, particularly as various different industries and stakeholders are looking for means to reduce emissions, again, on grid or off grid or in their industrial processes. And indeed, in terms of some of the communities, Indigenous communities, for instance, that are looking for options that they're in terms of increasing their availability to clean energy as well. World leaders are making climate change commitments. We're actually at a point right now where we're just a few days away from COP26 starting overseas, and all countries are making those commitments. And it's really quite clear that there's a real emphasis to identifying multiple technologies, including nuclear, including SMRs, to enable that transition away from coal power generation, particularly, and an emphasis to reducing emissions. And as many, increasingly world leaders are pointing that there's no real path forward without the inclusion of nuclear in those plans as the planet is looking to attain its goals. As you may be aware, or I'm sure you're all aware, but provincial governments of Saskatchewan, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Alberta have come together, committed to looking at SMR technology and developing and deploying it as a tool to achieve their goals as well, and as a means of generating clean energy that could be used in a number of different ways. So it's quite an exciting time from that perspective. Some of the folks who we're working very closely with in terms of our utilities, you may recognize some, but SaskPower, Ontario Power Generation, Bruce Power, and New Brunswick Power work quite closely together to develop this opportunity. Some of the small modular reactor companies are involved, or technologies, and each one has its own technological footprint. But there are multiple companies out there, and they're going through different approaches as relates to marketing themselves, and as well as dealing with the regulator and getting insights in terms of the opportunities. So it's quite an exciting time. We're witnessing sort of creation of a new market. In terms of timelines, the time for these technologies and the opportunity really is short term, just given the nature of how projects and the time that projects need to take to develop into reality. We have Stream 1 on-grid opportunities with the ETA time, as it were, by 2028. Stream 2, which is the next generation of reactors that New Brunswick is looking at a little bit further down the track with a time frame of 2035. And we have the much smaller reactors for those mining and maybe smaller communities with the time frame out by 2026. I should mention that in the Stream 1 is where the on-grid opportunities are, and I think you'll hear more from SaskPower in that regard in terms of what their thinking is, and that is an exciting opportunity to be a first mover in that stream. So again, Canada's on track to be a first mover. I think the discussions in Saskatchewan are very important, and the alignment between industry, utilities, and governments, and the regulator and stakeholders to enable SMR, small modular reactors, is really quite evident, and really looking forward to this type of engagement and discussions as stakeholders in Saskatchewan are looking to understand this technology more. So thank you very much. I hope I kept my presentation within the time frame, and looking forward to any questions.
Yeah, thanks so much, George. If anybody has questions for George, please go ahead and either if you want to come off mute and ask your question, or if you want to go ahead and put it in the question box. And while we're on that subject, Adam, I just want to make sure that I've put a couple notes in there. Can everybody, am I using the right, where it says all questions? I just want to make sure when people start asking questions that I can actually answer them. Hi.
Hi, Leanne. Yes, you can answer the individual questions through that
Thanks. So
Q&A box.
Joan had a question, I think for you, George, maybe for Iain, but she asked if the slowpoke, does it meet the standards of an SMR? Is it considered a small modular reactor?
Very good question. Yes, I mean, the small modular reactors are new technologies, but at the same time, the principles of those technologies are based on smaller reactors existing in the past. So whether it was slow pokes that were used more so for research, not really for generating electricity. Some of the technology obviously was used in the defense industry in the United States, whether it was like aircraft carriers that used small reactors to generate electricity and power for those vessels. So some of those concepts are now turning into commercial opportunities in these new technologies that are built on some of those older technologies. So in that way, yes, there's a link as the technologies have evolved.
Thanks, George. So yeah, it's really important to SaskPower. The reason we're thankful to have George here is because, and Iain will talk about this a little bit later, but that we, small modular reactors are really a part of a national strategy, right, for clean energy. So Saskatchewan is kind of relying on what happens, or certainly interested, if maybe relying is not the proper word, but in what happens across Canada, because a fleet-based approach to deployment is really what's going to keep the economics manageable for us. So I'm going to ask Adam to take down George's presentation and to pop ours back up. And I'm going to introduce Iain Harry. Iain Harry has been leading the small modular reactor file, the nuclear file, on behalf of the provincial government and SaskPower for a number of years. He's got probably, I'm definitely the most experience on this file of anyone I've ever met. So we're really happy to have him leading this planning phase of what could be the first SMR in Saskatchewan. So I'm going to invite Iain to just run through a bit of our project planning. But first of all, he's going to start with just a little bit of context about why SaskPower is looking at nuclear and why now. So go ahead, Iain. I'm just going to pop up to this slide there. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Leanne. Can everybody hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share a little bit of the work we're doing at SaskPower with regard to the potential for deployment of nuclear power in Saskatchewan. Specifically, we're interested in nuclear power from small modular reactors. I'm going to spend 10 or 20 minutes, maybe a bit more than that, just talking about where we're at and how we got here, and then what are the next steps in the process that could ultimately result in Saskatchewan's first nuclear power project. And I guess maybe we'll start at the beginning and answer the question, or talk a little bit about the question of why. Why is SaskPower, why is the government of Saskatchewan interested in nuclear power, and why are we interested in it now? And I guess what I would say is Saskatchewan and SaskPower has been interested in nuclear power generation for 40 or 50 years. The earliest evaluations of nuclear and the potential for nuclear power in Saskatchewan go back to the early 1970s. And SaskPower has, on 4 or 5 occasions between 1970 and today, really taken a deep dive into the potential for deploying nuclear reactors in Saskatchewan to provide reliable baseload power for our province. And the economic assessment in every case was the practical application of nuclear was always strong, reliable baseload power for our province. The economics was the challenge. As long as we could burn coal and natural gas for power generation in Saskatchewan, then the economics of nuclear was going to be challenged because burning coal and gas is less expensive. But in every case, in every time, the assessment concluded that when Saskatchewan is restricted from emitting carbon dioxide, in other words, when we're restricted from using carbon energy, coal or gas for power generation, then nuclear is going to be a promising technology for our province. And so why now? Well, that condition is now upon us. We have, when we look out to 2050, I'll talk about it in a few minutes. The challenge that we have in front of us is, can we get to net zero carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, by 2050 in the entire economy? And in order to do that, we're going to have to eliminate emissions from the power grid first, so possibly before 2050. So the time that the condition the one condition that we always thought was going to be was going to have to be in place was restrictions on the amount of power we can generate from coal and gas. So here we are today in 2021, and we can see a future where 20, 30 years from now, we'll have to end our reliance on carbon-based energy. The other thing is that so while that's happening, while we are reducing our reliance on carbon-based energy from coal and gas, our demand for energy is going to increase, not just because we're using more things that use electricity and our economy continues to grow, but also because as we move to this objective in the future of net zero emissions, we will have to start to use electricity to provide the energy that used to be provided by fossil fuels, and that's going to increase the requirement for power generation in Saskatchewan. So to address that challenge of how do we get from where we are today in Saskatchewan today, SaskPower gets about 70% of our total power generation from either coal or natural gas. 10 years ago, it was more than 80%. And 9 years from now, we will get none of our generation. We will have retired all of our conventional coal fleet, and that's a requirement of federal environmental legislation that we need to retire coal plants by the end of 2029. So nuclear power is just one of the clean energy options, the zero emissions options that SaskPower is evaluating. We continue to assess the potential for carbon capture on our coal-fired power generation, and you may also have noticed that there is a lot of interest globally in the use of carbon capture technology in other industries, particularly in the fertilizer industry and in the cement making industry, where carbon emissions are going to have to come down dramatically over the next number of years. And there's a strong case for using carbon capture to help us advance with that work. As well as wind and solar. Don't have to tell people from rural municipalities that we have really, really good wind and solar resources in Saskatchewan. And we're looking for every opportunity we can to get more solar and wind onto the grid. Energy storage will help us to do that. We are just about to commission our first biomass project near Meadow Lake. We're advancing with Canada's first utility scale geothermal project in partnership with a company from Saskatoon called Deep Earth Energy Production. And that is a project that's being watched with great interest around the world. We have a lot of hydro assets in Saskatchewan, and we have hydro import contracts from Manitoba. We're evaluating the potential for hydrogen production, both as a transportation fuel and also to fuel power generation. And we're looking at nuclear power from small modular reactors. So all of those things are on the table for SaskPower. And the question is not really which one of these ones do we choose. It's not a matter of choosing either or. We're likely going to need a combination of all of them to get to the emissions goals and ensure we have the clean, reliable power that we're going to require to support the continued growth of our province. I guess I can advance the slides. Good. So I'm not going to spend too much more time on why nuclear power, but George mentioned that the world is going to get together here in a few days in the United Kingdom at COP26 to talk about environmental regulation and specifically CO2 emission reduction. And I think what I expect will happen in those discussions that include most of the world's leaders is a commitment to accelerate the reduction of CO2 emissions from where those plans are today, particularly in countries that are emitting the most CO2. And those countries don't include Canada, China, Russia, India, the United States are the countries that if we don't address their climate or their emissions, we're not going to be successful. And Canada is already taking lots of steps. In Saskatchewan, our goal is to reduce our emissions by 50% over the next 9 years. So we're already taking pretty significant steps. And I think you're going to see the world putting even more pressure on governments globally to accelerate their climate change plans. And that's going to have a pretty big impact on what we do here in Saskatchewan. So nuclear power is a big part of what the future might hold in our province. So I'm going to talk a lot more about how what we're doing to advance the development of nuclear power in Saskatchewan. But before I do that, you just heard me talk at quite a bit of length about zero emissions and achieving net zero emissions from our power system. Some of you may have noticed that in the federal election that was just concluded, the platform of the Liberal Party included a commitment to net zero from the power grid by 2035, which is a very, very big challenge for jurisdictions like Saskatchewan and Alberta, and it's going to take some pretty significant action to achieve, if it's achievable at all. And so the question is, how important is it to you that SaskPower achieves net zero from our power grid, just in general?
Thanks, everyone. It looks like there's a mixed reaction so far. Very important at about 33, somewhat important at 63.
Great. Okay.
Got some more people participating yet. Just sorry, don't quite have everybody's answers up yet.
It's interesting, Leanne, that you know,
yeah.
we ask this question often when we're having discussions with people in Saskatchewan, and I'm always interested that it's clearly a priority that we address emissions in Saskatchewan, and there's a lot of discussion about how to do that and at what pace to do it at. That's a really important consideration for SaskPower. Because you know, I mentioned that we get most of our power today from coal and gas, and there's a reason for that. We have lots of coal and gas, and the cost of making electricity from coal and gas is less than the cost of making electricity from other generation sources, and that includes wind and solar if you need to make that wind and solar reliable. In fact, to make it reliable today, we have to rely on natural gas. So the question of the pace at which we can advance with these objectives is something worth considering and discussing as we talk about climate change plans in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, so the poll is now closed. We have somewhat important at 53, very important at 40, and then not important at all at 8%. So thanks everybody for participating. Just, yeah, a little bit of context there. I've been around for a while, and I remember, you know, before regulatory guidelines were in place, you know, the fact that SaskPower was going to be working towards an emissions reduction goal, you know, just wasn't as important because of the cost associated, but we've certainly seen a switch now. So thanks for your participation. We have a couple other polls built in, and turn it back over to Iain. Thanks, Iain.
Okay, thanks, Leanne. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about what SaskPower specifically doing around nuclear power generation from SMRs, and I'm hoping that by the time we get done our discussion today, I will have covered off some of the questions that we get asked most often around nuclear power in general and small modular reactors in particular. And the first question is, what is an SMR? George talked a little bit about that in his presentation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We get a lot of people asking us about the time frame for nuclear power. Nuclear power generation is a very highly regulated activity in Canada, and it takes a while to get nuclear power to the grid. From the time you decide you want it until you have power coming from a nuclear source is 10 or 12 years, or potentially even more than that, because of the very strict, stringent regulatory process, environmental, social, indigenous, and economic impacts that need to be considered as part of that process. So a lot of people say, well, boy, we've got a tough challenge with climate change. We need to act immediately. SMRs, it's going to take too long for SMRs to make a real difference, and we'll address that issue as we and that question as we go through. Another thing that we get is from people is either how much does nuclear power cost, or some people say, isn't it too expensive compared to the alternatives? Often people put up, they say, well, it's pretty expensive, it's going to take too long, we should just build wind and solar. And so we'll address that question of this either or consideration that we often hear when we have discussions around future power supply. Another one is, and it's a really important question, we get asked at every time that we talk about nuclear power, and that is, what do you do with the waste? How much of it is it? Is it dangerous? How do you store it? Where do you store it? And we'll cover that off a little bit. And then, of course, everybody wants to know where you would put an SMR in Saskatchewan. And here's a bit of a spoiler. We're gonna, if we continue to develop nuclear power, and we end up deploying a nuclear reactor in Saskatchewan, a small modular reactor, it's going to be built somewhere in a rural municipality. That's for certain. We don't know which one yet, but I can narrow it down to that. We're going to build it in an RM in Saskatchewan if the decision is ultimately made to proceed, and that is a decision that's going to take many, many more years of work to inform, and a lot more engagement with people all across the province, including leaders in our rural municipalities. So first of all, nuclear in Saskatchewan, George talked about it a little bit. Nuclear is nothing new to Saskatchewan. We have been mining uranium in this province for decades, and we have a strong and sustainable, highly sustainable record of uranium development in our province. And we've been shipping yellowcake, which is what the uranium ore gets turned into, for export. We ship it all over the world, where it gets turned into fuel for nuclear reactors, and those reactors generate about 15% of the world's energy. In Canada, that generates 60% of Ontario's power. In the United States, it generates 80% of the zero emissions electricity that flows into their grid. So not 80% of the total, but 80% of the zero emissions electricity that is available to the United States today comes from nuclear power. We have a lot of nuclear, we have a very proud and long history of nuclear innovation, research and development in Saskatchewan. First focused on medical, nuclear medicine, where we pioneered the use of radiation in the diagnosis and treatment of cancer. Sylvia Fedoruk, who the Canadian Centre for Nuclear Innovation at the University of Saskatchewan is its namesake, the Sylvia Fedoruk Centre. Sylvia Fedoruk was a pioneer in nuclear medicine, and her work has led to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people's lives being saved and extended because of the work we did in the area of nuclear medicine in Saskatchewan. The Canadian Light Source is one of the world's premier material science research facilities. All sorts of nuclear research happens at the Canadian Light Source in Saskatoon. We have a couple of electron accelerators at the University of Saskatchewan, a tokamak fusion reactor, also located at the University of Saskatchewan, and for 40 years the Saskatchewan Research Council operated a slowpoke research reactor, which has now been retired and decommissioned. Someone asked about that in the chat. Is the slowpoke considered an SMR? And it's certainly considered a small modular reactor. It's considered small. It's certainly not modular. And it's very different in its both its purpose and its design from the kind of reactor technologies that we're looking at today. One of the things about the slowpoke is that it used highly enriched uranium, which and it required no refueling. Its primary focus was research. It had a very low power generation capacity. It was never used for electrical power generation. But it was a really important part of the research infrastructure at our university and served particularly in the mining sector for decades. And also gave the Saskatchewan Research Council 40 years of operating experience. They're the only entity in Saskatchewan that has held an operating license for a nuclear reactor in our province. And I expect that you're going to see, we certainly have partnered with the SRC to do some of the licensing work that we need to do around SMRs. And I think there's interest in the SRC at looking at other potential roles they could play in the world of supporting SMR development in Canada. And we look forward to partnering with the university and with the Saskatchewan Research Council on that work as it advances. The Sylvia Fedoruk Center I mentioned. We also have a cyclotron facility which makes the isotopes that would be used if you go to the Royal University Hospital for diagnostics or for treatment of certain cancers. Those isotopes come from the cyclotron, which is located just a few hundred meters from Royal University Hospital. So we have a long history, and we continue to be innovators and leaders in the nuclear space in Saskatchewan. And the evaluation of SMRs is just another chapter in that whole process. I want to just touch on the waste products that come from nuclear power generation, because it's a question that we get from everybody, from our government, our board of directors, our executive, all the people we talk to when we engage on the subject of nuclear power. One of the questions that they want to know about is, what about the waste? So the picture you see here is it helps to understand what we do with the used nuclear fuel that comes out of a reactor. So once the nuclear fuel, which is made from uranium, has been used inside the reactor to generate heat and therefore power. Once that fuel is done, it's removed from the reactor and cooled in big swimming pools where the radiation from it is entirely isolated, so there's no emissions of radiation from the cooling pools at our nuclear reactor facilities in Canada. And 100% of the used nuclear fuel, which is considered high-level nuclear waste in Canada, it needs to be very carefully managed for a long time. And we've been managing our high-level waste for 7 decades in Canada sustainably and safely. And I'll talk a little bit about how we intend to continue to do that in the future. But when it comes out of those pools, it gets moved into dry storage in specially designed casks. And you see those containers with the numbers on them there. Those are casks that contain used nuclear fuel from the reactors at Darlington in Ontario. Darlington provides about 25% of all the power generated in Ontario. And that's one of the used fuel storage facilities. There's no danger to those folks standing in front of those casks, because there's zero background radiation in that building. Now, if you stepped outside the building, which is located on Lake Ontario, 70 kilometers from Toronto, if you stepped outside that building on a sunny day, you would be exposed to some additional radiation from the sun. And if you wanted to get away from that, you would go back into the used fuel management facility there, where there's zero background radiation, because it's stored safely with no emissions of any kind of radiation. And you could store it in that facility for hundreds or even thousands of years. In all of the used fuel I mentioned in Canada that's been generated from our reactors is stored on site just like this, safely and sustainably by the utilities that generated it. The cost of managing it, short, medium, and long term, is paid for by the utilities. They have to pay into a fund that is managed by the Canadian the Nuclear Waste Management Organization for every kilowatt hour of power generated from a nuclear reactor. So the cost of the long-term storage of our used fuel, high-level nuclear waste, is included in the cost of the power when it is sold to customers by the utilities that generate nuclear power. In the long run, the high-level waste that we generate, the used nuclear fuel we generate from our reactors in Canada, will be stored deep under the ground in a geological storage facility that is being developed by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. And that will be located somewhere, likely on the Bruce Peninsula in northern Ontario. And I understand the decision on the specific site for that facility will be made in the next few years, and that site will be completed in about 20 years. So once that site is complete, then casks like the ones that you see here will be moved into it, stored safely and sustainably for forever underground, so that and there'll be room in that facility for all of the high-level nuclear fuel that's generated in Canada. So that's what we do with
Hey,
the
Iain.
high-level fuel, high-level nuclear waste, I should say.
Sorry, just had a quick question that is relevant to this slide. So somebody asked about the fact that there's a lot of valuable fuel still left in used fuel when it comes out of reactors, and now with SMR development, are there opportunities now to kind of start to reuse that fuel?
Yeah, there is, and I'll talk about that in a second. But that the person makes a good point. One of our colleagues that worked with us as we advanced the development of, as we evaluated the potential for nuclear power in Saskatchewan, used to say to me that the best part of nuclear power generation is the used fuel, because when it's extracted, the fuel from our CANDU reactors, when it's extracted from the reactor, about 90% of the potential energy in that fuel is still there. They only use about 10% of the potential energy in the uranium that is in that fuel bundle while it's in the reactor. So you can imagine that Canada's stores of used nuclear fuel represent the largest single source of potential energy in our country, far more energy than is stored in oil and gas reserves in our country. And the question is, could you turn that used fuel into new fuel and use it to generate power and in the process burn some of that used fuel and not have to store it long term? And the answer is yes, and I'll talk about that in a second. So yeah, it's a great question. The plan in Canada is to store most of it in a long-term facility deep underground, but there's a lot of work underway in Canada and globally to develop nuclear reactor technologies that could use the used fuel from light and heavy water reactors instead of mining new uranium. So I've talked about what a small modular reactor is. SaskPower specifically defines small as between 50 and 300 megawatts per generating unit. There are reactors that are in development, including in Canada, not just in development, but that are in the process of being deployed, specifically in Ontario, that are 5 megawatts per generating unit. We call those very small reactors, or sometimes they're called micro modular reactors. And they are specifically for use in off-grid communities, remote northern communities, remote mining and industrial facilities. They have the potential to be used on the edge of the grid, where the reliability of the electricity is less than it is when you're closer to where the power is generated. So those very small reactors are being advanced in Canada. SaskPower is not focused, on the very small reactors. We're focused on utility scale reactors of between 50 megawatts and 300 megawatts per generating unit. And the reason why we focus on that is because that about matches the size of our current generating units, our gas generating units and our coal generating units, which run anywhere from 50 to 350 megawatts per generating unit. The reason that's important is because our system is designed to be reliable using generation units of that size, and integrating larger units starts to really, the cost of integrating larger units is expensive. So if we can minimize the integration cost, the connection cost of our power projects, that means we can offer the electricity at a lower price for our customers. And I'm sure that you in rural municipalities have had discussions with people like wind developers and solar developers about locating power generation projects in your municipalities. And one of the key considerations is the cost of connecting that generation to the grid. No different with nuclear power. We take into consideration the size of the unit so that we can maintain the reliability of the grid at the lowest possible cost. We like small, and the S also stands for small investment, much smaller than a 1,000 megawatt nuclear reactor. And the size of the investment of SMRs is a size that a small utility like SaskPower, a smaller province like Saskatchewan, a smaller grid like that we can handle that kind of capital investment. So it's appealing to us, and it opens up the potential for SMRs, not just in Saskatchewan, but to lots of other jurisdictions that are smaller jurisdictions with smaller generating units and have challenges with the capital cost of the larger units and the integration cost of those larger units. So one of the things about nuclear power from SMRs is it opens up new markets for clean energy from nuclear power using these SMR technologies. The M stands for modular construction specifically. The idea in the long term is that these nuclear reactors would be built in modules in a factory setting, produced at lower cost, and delivered to site where they would be assembled and brought into production. And we think that if that modular construction and assembly process can be realized, it will help us to address important project risks around the project schedule, and the cost of the units themselves, which is a really important part of nuclear power generation projects. And SMRs, especially, well, all SMRs, and especially the next generation of SMRs, build on the strong safety case that nuclear reactors already offer. It's the safest form of power generation that we have available to us in the world today. The safety record of the nuclear industry is unmatched with regard to power generation, and the next generation of SMRs is going to strengthen that case, and we think that's appealing. There's also a lot of operational features of the advanced reactors that we think are going to be pretty well fitted to Saskatchewan. So that's a little primer on what an SMR is. Canada, you heard George talk about the Canada as a potential leader in first mover projects, nuclear projects from small modular reactor technologies. And this is a bit of a snapshot of what's happening in Canada. George talked about the 3 streams of technology deployment. Stream 1 being SMR technologies that are far enough along in their development. Keep in mind, SMR technology is emerging. It's new technology. It's built on a lot of knowledge that we've built over the last 70 years as we have built the nuclear industry in the world and in North America. But this next generation of SMRs is just now moving through the regulatory process, moving through the engineering design process, and we see the first projects completed in Canada in 2028, 2029, 2030. We call those Stream 1 applications, and they're focused on utility scale SMRs that would be used for on-grid production. So the 3 that we're looking at in Saskatchewan, and we're partnered with OPG to evaluate these 3 technologies, is a light water or a boiling water reactor, 300 megawatt reactor that is being developed by GE Hitachi. So it's a boiling water reactor. It's a light water reactor. In other words, the the temperature inside the core is controlled. The heat is removed from the core with water, and water is used as a moderator as well. X Energy is developing an advanced fourth generation high temperature gas reactor. So that reactor is is about 80 megawatts per generating unit. We're evaluating the potential for a power plant that would have 4 of those, so about 320 megawatts. And that reactor is cooled with helium. So the helium is instead of water to remove heat from the core, and that heat is then used to boil water and make electricity, make steam, which makes electricity. Very different design from the boiling water reactor. And then Terrestrial Energy is developing an integral molten salt reactor, and that is a reactor that uses a molten salt, almost a liquid fuel, where the fuel and the coolant, the molten salt serves to carry the fuel and also cool the reactor. Very innovative design with a lot of interesting safety features and a lot of applications in Canada for both utilities and industry. So very different reactors that we're evaluating. OPG will be, what they have said publicly is that they will make a decision sometime in the next few months about which one of these 3 designs they will be advancing for their first project, with the objective of getting their first SMR connected to the grid by the end of 2028. And SaskPower will make a decision about whether we can align with that technology choice or not sometime next year. The second stream of SMRs being developed in Canada is being driven by New Brunswick, the government of New Brunswick, and New Brunswick Power. New Brunswick Power already has one CANDU reactor, generates about 650, 700 megawatts, with about 35% of New Brunswick's power comes from nuclear today. And they are evaluating the potential to, they're doing more than evaluating, they're advancing with the development of nuclear power from 2 small modular reactor designs. The ARC-100 is a sodium-cooled fast reactor, so instead of using water or molten salt or helium, it uses, well, it uses sodium, which is kind of like the molten salt reactor to cool its core. 100 megawatt design, and they expect to have that deployed in New Brunswick by the early to mid 2030s. And Moltex is developing another molten salt reactor. This one's interesting because this one is a reactor that will use the used fuel from New Brunswick's CANDU reactors. So they'll take that used fuel, reconstitute it, and turn it into new fuel, which will then be fed into the Moltex reactor and used to generate power. So really interesting project there, and those designs are more likely going to be deployed in the mid to late 2030s. And then stream 3 of the very small reactors, and these are the ones that are coming first. OPG, Ontario Power Generation, has partnered with Ultrasafe Nuclear Corporation to build its first, to create a company called Global First Power. And Global First Power is advancing a micro modular reactor that is going to build at Chalk River, Ontario, which is where Canada's premier nuclear research facility is. It's about 200 kilometers northwest of Ottawa. That's a 5 megawatt demonstration project at Chalk River, and will be connected to the grid in 2026. And Westinghouse is working with Bruce Power in Ontario to evaluate the potential to develop the Evinci 5 megawatt very small reactor. And no plan so far from that collaboration to advance a first project, but I would expect that they will be making some decisions about that the next months or few years. So a lot going on in Canada with regard to nuclear reactors. This is a picture of the Darlington Nuclear Power Plant, owned and operated by Ontario Power Generation. And this plant has 3,500 megawatts of nuclear generating capacity. It's located 70 kilometers east of Toronto, right on Lake Ontario. And if that facility was located in Saskatchewan, on most days, it would generate all the power that we needed. It could take care of almost all of our power generation requirements in our province from the one plant. These are 4 CANDU reactors of about 700 megawatts per reactor, 750 megawatts per reactor. When they, as they rebuild them, they can get to 3,500 megawatts. So these were built 25 years ago. They're going to operate for another 25 to 30 years in Ontario. And this particular plant is 1,200 acres. So where you see in the foreground, that 4-unit plant's about 1,200 acres. In the background there, you see that building. That's not what an SMR looks like. It's not what an SMR-based power plant looks like, but that's about how much space 600 megawatts of nuclear power would take, which would be, 2 300 megawatt projects deployed. It's about 30 to 45 acres for 300 megawatts of power generation is all the space that an SMR takes, and all of the fuel all of the used fuel would be stored on site for, there's enough space in that 40 or 50 acres to store all of the used fuel on site until it can be disposed of long-term in a deep geological storage facility that's being developed in Ontario. So it gives you a sense, big nuclear power, lots of space, SMRs, very, very little space, very small footprint, a lot different than when you think of the conventional nuclear reactors that we have in the world. This is what a GE Hitachi boiling water SMR would look like. About 40 acres, and the building that you see, the larger building, would contain the 300 megawatt reactor, the turbine generator units that would turn that heat into electricity. And you see in the background a large body of water. Nuclear power requires water for cooling, primarily for cooling the turbine. So difference between big nuclear, which is what we have in Canada today and in most places around the world, and SMRs is really all about how much space it takes, which is not very much. What's driving our interest in SMRs, as I said at the beginning, is emission reduction. The blue line you see here is the emission reduction path that SaskPower is on today. So in 2021, we expect to emit about 14 million tons of CO2 from our coal and gas-fired power generation. That's about 70% of our power comes from those two sources. Between now and 2030, we are going to cut that emission in about half, by about 50%, possibly more. At least 50% though, over 9 years, which is quite incredible when you think about it. That in just 9 years we're going to retire 100% of our coal fleet. And we're going to add wind and solar and a little bit more natural gas to support it, and we're going to cut our emissions by 50%. The challenge is if we continued on with that strategy of replacing coal with natural gas and relying on natural gas to support the base load reliable generation that we need in Saskatchewan. If we continue to do that, you see what happens. That blue line stays at about where it is in 2030 all the way out to 2050. So we're at 50% of 2005 levels by 2050. Our objective is to get to zero emissions from power generation by 2050. And the government of Canada has said it wants to get to zero emissions in the entire economy by 2050. So we are looking at all of those options I went through earlier, zero emissions options that would allow us to steepen the curve, to steepen the emissions curve. That's the green line you see. So if our transition from coal relied less on natural gas and more on hydro, SMRs, solar and wind, geothermal, biomass, other zero emissions energy options, you see that we can steepen the curve of emission reduction and avoid the emission of 74 million tons of CO2. Why that's important, aside from the potential to help support our work to address climate change, is the financial impact of that. The government of Canada in 2030 has said that they are going to assess a carbon penalty of $170 per ton. And that could, a lot of people think that $170 per ton is not the ceiling for that price, that it'll continue to go up. But at $170 a ton, multiply that by 74 million tons, and you get billions and billions of dollars of carbon penalties that we would avoid paying. And if we can avoid paying them, our customers can avoid paying them. So the opportunity for SMR deployment is to contribute to that clean energy generation mix instead of relying so much on natural gas as we advance through from 2030 to 2050. And so our objective is could we get nuclear power to the grid starting in the early to mid 2030s at a competitive price compared to the alternatives that are available at that time. The benefits could be quite significant. One of the things that separates nuclear power in Saskatchewan from all of the other generation options that we have available to us is that we don't have nuclear power here. So we'd be creating a new industry. SaskPower is evaluating the potential to deploy 300 megawatts of nuclear power by 2032, 2033, 2034. I'll show you the schedule in a second. But one of the things that is important is that we can't just, we're not evaluating the potential to just deploy one, but the potential to deploy a fleet of 4 between 2032 and 2042. And if we did that and operated them for 60 years, the economic impact is about $8.8 billion over the life of that SMR fleet. Just getting the first unit to the grid generates $1.6 billion in GDP. And that translates into a lot of jobs and a lot of taxes paid federal, provincial, and local, and a lot of salary. So the economic potential for SMRs is significant, and creating an industry that would generate clean energy and support permanent long-term jobs for 60, 70, 80 years is one of the big drivers of SMR development in Saskatchewan, in addition to the clean energy that we would get from it. That economic value could help us offset the economic impact that will happen as we retire our coal-fired power generation and the coal mining operations that go along with it in southeast and south central Saskatchewan. Based on the very early research that we've done, we think the potential is that it could offset those losses entirely on a provincial basis, and we're doing more work to understand how that compares to other generation options for other generation mixes that don't include SMRs. But the early returns there are that there's the potential for significant economic impact if we deploy SMRs. It reduces our reliance on natural gas for sure, and that reduces the risk of carbon penalties increasing over the next number of years, which is a pretty high risk. And in the long run, it supports a more aggressive deployment of wind and solar. So we think that all of those things create a pretty good value proposition for Saskatchewan if the power can be generated competitively. So then, if you're going to develop a nuclear power plant, the first 2 things you need to do are find a site and choose a technology. And then the next thing you do is you advance through the licensing process in Canada to license the site and to prepare the site for a nuclear power plant, and then construct the technology that you have. So you need a license to prepare a site, you need a license to construct the reactor on the site, and then once it's built, you need a license to operate it. So the very first thing is you need a site. You can't do much without one, and that's one of the first pieces of major work that we're doing, is starting to look for where would you site a nuclear power plant in Saskatchewan. And the considerations there are lots of things to consider when doing that. It's not unlike any other generation site selection process that SaskPower uses. We need to take into consideration the requirements of the SMR technology itself. It needs some water, just like gas-fired power plants or just like coal-fired power plants. Water is an important consideration. It needs access to qualified people. It needs emergency infrastructure. There are regulatory requirements as well, a long list of regulatory requirements that the site needs to meet. And the utility also has some requirements. It's important where we put this as it relates to the the location of our existing transmission lines, also the growth of our where's the growth for demand and power over the next 10 or 20 years, and where does the future transmission development going to go? So all of those things, the requirement of the technology, the requirement of the utility, and the requirement of the regulators create the technical basis for where you would site a nuclear reactor. And then the most important part about that is that it's built on a foundation of public engagement and feedback. And so as we work through the process of identifying potential regions where we could put an SMR from a technical perspective, we'll start to engage with people all across Saskatchewan, and particularly in those regions of interest, to get some input and feedback on what are the things that are important to you. When we site a nuclear power plant, what are the things that you want to make sure we're thinking about, in addition to the things we've already talked about? So you can expect that as we move into 2022, into the spring and summer probably of 2022, we'll start to get a better sense of where technically you could put a nuclear power plant, and start to talk and start to get into those communities, and all across the province for that matter, to talk about, what are the things that you want us to keep in mind as we think about siting a nuclear power plant, and that's a discussion that will go on all through the process of developing, constructing, and operating nuclear technologies in Saskatchewan.
Iain, just before you go to the next slide, there was a question in the chat. It's a really good one that probably could be shared with everybody, about the water requirements. There were actually a couple of questions about, like, how much does it need a large body of water to be to operate, and then another question just about, adjacent, how close to water would an SMR need to be?
All thermal power generation requires water for cooling. A lot of people think, though, that that when they think about cooling, they think about cooling the reactor, and there is some water required to cool reactors where you're using a light water reactor technology or a heavy water reactor technology. Two of the three reactor designs we're evaluating don't use water for cooling the reactor at all. But all thermal power projects where you're using heat to create steam to spin a turbine require water to cool the turbine. So a nuclear power generation, steam spins a turbine that spins a generator that makes electricity, and we need water to cool that turbine. And so it's important that it's located close to water. Nuclear power plant, a 300 megawatt nuclear power plant, needs about the same amount of water for cooling as a 300 megawatt coal-fired power plant, maybe slightly more in some circumstances. But if you were going to site a 300 megawatt coal plant, the water that's required to cool the turbine at that plant is about the same as the water required to cool a similar sized nuclear power plant. So water is an important consideration. But the water is not, very little water is actually consumed in nuclear power generation. It's just heated up. So we take water out of the environment, we use it to cool the plant, and then we put the water back into the environment. And so the environmental impact of the water is that you increase the temperature of the water, and depending on how large the water body is, you could increase the temperature of the water body that goes back into. So when we're looking at siting and evaluating the environmental impacts, we look at what is the impact on that increase in water temperature in the water body on the aquatic life that's in the water, and the communities that are built around the water and the animals that access it. Good question. Water is an important consideration, not the consumption so much, but the change in temperature is what we look at, and that's the major impact of nuclear power when it comes to water. I talked a little bit about what I said earlier. It takes a long time. It takes a long time to develop a nuclear power project, and that's because while we're talking about small modular reactors, we are still talking about a significant construction project. We're building a utility scale power plant, and the regulatory process, both the licensing of the site, which is overseen in Canada by a federal regulator, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, That the CNSC is a highly regarded and very tough regulator of everything that involves nuclear processes in Canada, including nuclear power generation, but also nuclear medicine and facilities that operate nuclear technologies for research. They regulate hospitals that use nuclear medicine. They regulate the oil patch using radioactive instruments downhole. There are all sorts of nuclear applications in Canada, in addition to nuclear power generation, that the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission oversees. And nuclear power generation is just one part of their role. They evaluate and either grant or don't grant a license to develop sites for nuclear power plant, construction license to build a nuclear power plant, and a license to operate those plants. And they also are also issue a license to decommission the plant and then abandon it at the end of its operating life. And the process of, from the time you choose a site, from the time you decide that you want to advance with the planning phase of a nuclear power project, which is where we're at today. You see that at the top left-hand corner, it says number 1 there. That's where we're at. We're moving through the first year of work that will ultimately, by the end of 2034, result in the commissioning of a nuclear power plant, or the beginning of 2030, at the beginning of 2033, I should say, commissioning of the first nuclear unit in Saskatchewan, if we decide to advance that far. But the decision to construct will not be made until 2029, and that decision will require all the work we're doing between now and then. Without doing all the work to select the site, select the technology, develop the licenses, and work through the process of impact assessment, which is new in Canada. The environmental impact assessment has been expanded to include social, indigenous, and economic impact. And SaskPower, if we advance, if we continue to advance with our project, will be the first utility scale nuclear project in the country to go through that process. All of that we expect is going to take from now until the end of 2028, early 2029, at which point we would be in a position to make a decision to construct a nuclear power plant. So very long-term process, takes 3.5, 4 years to build these units and about a year to fully commission them. So, you know, if we don't advance with the work today in the planning phase, the licensing phase, the impact assessment phase, we will not be in a position to make a construction decision, and we'll eliminate SMRs as a clean energy option for our province. So it's critically important that we advance with this work so we can inform a decision as to whether we could construct and operate nuclear power and have it as part of our power supply in the 2030s, 2040s, and 2050s. The other thing I want to just mention, which I haven't up to now, is that if we were to advance with the first unit, we would also be assessing the potential to deploy 3 additional tranches of 300 megawatts for a total of 1,200 megawatts between 2032 and 2042. That's because there are some critical path things to be in place for Saskatchewan, for SMRs or nuclear power in general to be feasible. The first one is we are not a nuclear jurisdiction, so we need partners. We need experienced utility partners in Canada to lead the way, to go first, to use their expertise to advance first-of-a-kind projects in Canada. And as some of you may know, SaskPower has partnered with Ontario Power Generation, which is the largest nuclear operator in Canada. It generates about 30-35% of Ontario's power and owns all of Ontario's nuclear reactors. We've partnered with OPG to evaluate the potential for fleet-based deployment in Canada of SMRs, where the same SMR technology is deployed first in Ontario, and you heard me talk about how their plan is to select the technology and advance with its construction with the objective of getting their first unit power to the grid in 2028, early 2029. And that's critical. That's critical path for Saskatchewan, because we would use the experience of OPG in developing, constructing, and commissioning their first plant to inform a construction decision in 2029 as to whether we advance with the construction of our first plant. And fleet-based deployment, where we have the same design in Ontario and Saskatchewan and potentially Alberta, is important because it drives down the risk of these projects and the operating costs of projects. So a national SMR fleet of the same design with utility partners where an experienced nuclear partner goes first, and then Saskatchewan benefits from that experience with regard to the cost of the electricity and the risk of the project, risk of schedule or cost overruns, is really important to Saskatchewan, and that's why we're advancing and evaluating the potential to partner with OPG. Another thing that's really important from SaskPower's perspective is Indigenous participation. And when we think about Indigenous participation and we engage with our Indigenous communities and partners, what we hear from them is there's a lot of interest, first of all, in what we're doing and what's the impact on the environment, on their traditional lands and their hunting and fishing, their communities, and they really want to understand that. But if they can be satisfied that the development of SMRs is sustainable and that their communities can benefit, then I think they've expressed interest in participating in the development of the supply chains that are going to be required to support nuclear development, participating in the workforce that needs to be developed, and potentially participating in the ownership of nuclear generation. So we're carefully listening to what our Indigenous partners are saying, what they want us to think about, and where their interests lie. And we think that Indigenous participation is critical for us to be successful as we advance with our clean energy planning at SaskPower. The federal government has a role to play too. We're thinking about nuclear power because the federal government has required us to retire our low-cost, highly reliable fossil fuel-based generation from wind or from coal and natural gas. And what that means is the federal government has a role to play in helping us evaluate alternatives. And so what we need them to do is share the risk of the planning phase of nuclear power. And that would include helping to pay for the cost of the planning phase. They need to be risk-sharing partners as we move through the construction phase and into the operating phase. And that's not risk of an accident or something bad happening. It's the financial risk that's related to these projects that we're focused on. The bottom line of all of it is that whatever generation mix we choose that we develop in Saskatchewan needs to take into consideration the price of the power. And so our number one evaluation criteria with SMRs is the power from SMRs competitively priced compared to the alternatives, zero emissions, base load alternatives, reliable power available to us in the early to mid 2030s. So those are the conditions that we think need to be in place. And all of those conditions are either in place or are developing quite well. And as a result, we feel pretty strong about the potential for SMR deployment to be successful in Saskatchewan as we advance in the very early days of SMR deployment. We're in the first year of our planning of a project that's going to take 12 years to complete. So Leanne, I think I'll wrap my presentation up there. Happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Yeah, thanks so much, Iain. So there were actually there's two really good questions that I've seen here. And before I take a stab at answering this one, somebody has asked about, the fact that safety is such a huge concern. Obviously, it's a concern for SaskPower as well. But how the horrible tragedy at Chernobyl, that reactor accident, and even the tsunami that hit the coast of Japan and then caused at Fukushima Daiichi caused the meltdown of those reactors. So there's a question here about how can we put the minds of our customers and residents and friends and colleagues and employees at ease by helping folks understand what's being done to prevent those kinds of situations being happening again here in Saskatchewan and in Canada for that matter. Would you be able to take a stab at that?
Yeah, for sure. Safety is the most important part of nuclear power development. It's the first consideration in every step along the way. It's the reason why it takes so long to deploy nuclear power, because of the focus on safety, the safe development, construction, and operation of nuclear power plants. And Canada has a 70-year record of an impeccable, stellar safety record when it comes to operating nuclear power plants and managing the high level and low, high, medium, and low level waste that is generated from those plants. And Leanne mentioned the potential danger. So nuclear power plants there's a long list of reasons why it's pretty great. It's great technology, generates clean energy. A lot of it doesn't take up much space, emits no CO2 and almost no waste. So the environmental impact is very, very low. Once the plant is built, the operating costs are really low and it's highly reliable, operates for 60 years. So all of that is really good. But one of the things that everybody knows about nuclear power is they know three things. They know Chernobyl, Fukushima, and 3 Mile Island. Most people don't know very much about any of those three nuclear accidents, other than that they happened. But the nuclear industry focuses on safety so that those kinds of things don't happen again. And that's why the safety record of nuclear power in the world is unmatched by any other power generation technology. So while those three accidents are really a serious thing, we have to make sure that we understand what happened and make sure it doesn't happen again. Overall, the generation of nuclear power is safe and by many orders of magnitude safer than all of the other ways that we generate power in the world. So we start with that. Nuclear power is safe, but we have to be very conscious of ensuring that that story continues to be the case. And so regulators around the world work together, utilities work together to make sure that we learn a lesson from every safety related incident that happens, including those big ones. And the reactor technologies we're looking at, small modular reactor technologies, all three of them that we're looking at, have advanced safety features which address all of the things that happened at Chernobyl, at Fukushima, and at 3 Mile Island, including the things that really have nothing to do with power generation. At Fukushima, the nuclear accident was caused by a tidal wave. Those things get taken into consideration. What happens? How do we make sure that if another tidal wave hit a power plant, that these things won't happen again? So, the focus on safety in the nuclear industry is the number one priority everywhere in the world, and it's SaskPower's number one priority, not just with nuclear power, but with all of our generation facilities. And the safety record of the nuclear industry is one that we think supports the development of nuclear power in Saskatchewan, the expansion of nuclear power in Canada and globally to address climate change, because it's safe and it's sustainable. But we can never lose track of that focus on safety in everything that we do.
Yeah, thanks. Tanya said thank you. Couple other questions, Iain, about whether some of our existing coal, I'll say coal communities, because we look at them as coal families down in the southeast. If some of those sites that, since they're being decommissioned, might make appropriate sites for a nuclear plant, making use of some of the things you mentioned in the siting criteria, like some of the existing infrastructure and workforce and such.
Yeah, I think about the list of things that you have to take into consideration when you're siting a nuclear power plant. That southeast area of the province, given that we're going to retire our coal fleet, has a lot of strengths. Leanne mentioned some of them. First of all, we have the transmission. We have about Boundary Dam Power Station and Shand Power Station. Those are the two coal-fired power generations in just outside of Estevan, have about 900 megawatts of nuclear or of a power generation capacity. So we have to have 900 megawatts of transmission infrastructure available to take that power away. And when we retire those coal plants, we'll have 900 megawatts of transmission infrastructure. So that's a big asset when you have existing transmission that allows you to take the power away from the plant and distribute it around Saskatchewan. There's a qualified workforce at Boundary Dam. So Nuclear power is thermal. Coal-fired power and nuclear power are two examples of thermal power generation where you turn water into steam and use the steam to spin a turbine and a generator to make electricity. So we have people at Boundary Dam and Shan that understand that process of thermal power generation. So we have a qualified workforce. We also have a big industrial workforce down there because of the oil and gas industry. So that's pretty promising, and that is an important economic consideration for us. It's also a licensing requirement. We have to demonstrate that we can attract and retain a qualified workforce. So there's another asset in Southeast Saskatchewan, and we have lots of other communities that also have that asset. Not every community has 900 megawatts of transmission infrastructure, nearby. The water that's required for the existing gas plant or coal plants is adequate to support the nuclear power. At 600 megawatts of nuclear power, so that's another asset. And so when we think about where we site a nuclear plant, I talked about it: the requirements of the technology, the requirements of the utility, and the requirements of the regulator of the licensing of it. And when we look at those things, that's the stuff that we look at from a technical perspective to identify the best places in the province to put a nuclear power plant. And given the retirement plans in the southeast, a lot of the boxes get checked in that area of the province. The other, I always like to say that big technical basket is about 40% of what's required to site a nuclear power plant. The other 60% is what people in the community and what people in the province think. And so that's why I said, once we have the technical assessment and we say, well, from a technical perspective, here's the areas we think would be a pretty good fit. We're about 40% of the way to selecting a site for a nuclear power plant. The other 60% is talking to everybody in Saskatchewan about what that means. What does it mean? What's the impact on the province, on our environment, on our economy, on our emissions of building nuclear power from a small modular reactor technology? And what do people in the local area think about that? What do our First Nations communities, not just locally, but all around the province, what do they think about that? How does it impact their traditional territories, and how does it impact their communities? These are the things that will ultimately define a decision on, will put the final touches on a decision of where would we build a nuclear power plant. And you heard me say we're evaluating the first unit with the idea that we would deploy 300 megawatts by 2033, and then another 300 and another 300 and another 300 to get to 1,200 megawatts by 2042 at two sites, one with 600 megawatts and a second site with 600 megawatts. So what we're really looking for in Saskatchewan for our first site is a site that could accommodate 600 megawatts of nuclear power, even though our plan is only to advance the first 300 megawatts now, and we'll need to make a decision on how that evolves later as we evaluate the demand for electricity and a whole bunch of other factors. But some of the things that I talked about make Estevan a pretty attractive area for power generation.
Thanks. I'm going to give Iain just a bit of a break. We have a couple more questions to address, but I wanted to just move forward because we are at about 25 to noon. Get up and stretch. We've been keeping you here. It's been, an hour and a half. So there's a couple of questions that I wanted to make sure that we didn't miss here, an opportunity to have a conversation about. And one of them is what we circulated to you earlier. So somebody in the question box had asked, when will you know where this SMR might be located, or where the first one might be located? And I think Iain's kind of answered that really well, and that, we have a lot of technical criteria that we need to consider. It's definitely not something you could do an open call for and put anywhere. There are needs technically that need to be met. but there are also we need to know what communities and what people think, right? So that will help us kind of narrow down areas in the province where we might start our siting work, which we expect that to start in the spring. So before that time, we'd love to know, like, if we knocked on your door tomorrow and said, you know what, it's starting to look like you're a technically feasible community to build an SMR. How would you respond, first of all, and I guess on behalf of you personally, on behalf of your community, and then what would you want to know more about? So the reason we ask that is because we think we know, we have some information that we share, but it's important, really important, more important, to listen to what people want to know more about. So I invite you to please, either put your questions, your answers, your comments in the chat, or if you're more comfortable doing so, you can reach out to our team at any time through the public consultation email that we have at saskpower.com. So that's public consultation at saskpower.com. I actually will just put that in the comment box. But while you're thinking about that, Iain, there was one more question about whether or not small modular reactors could actually act as, I think what is meant is a backup source for wind and solar. Are these things, I guess, more operating as what we would call load followers as compared to other nuclear reactors?
Well, the reactor fleet that we have in Canada today, the big CANDU reactors, the reactor fleet that they have in the United States and around the world, large 1,000 megawatt, 1,500 megawatt reactors, are deployed on grids for baseload power generation, and they are operated ideally at maximum capacity all the time. So, and the reason for that is because, like any machine, like your car, or like any machine, bringing it like working it hard and then backing it off and working it hard and backing it off. It's like taking off from a stop sign and then screeching to a halt at the next one. Your car needs more maintenance. It costs a lot more to maintain than if you're driving smoothly down the highway at 65 miles an hour, 100 kilometers an hour. Same thing in the power business. When you increase, decrease the amount of power output that you have from any generating unit, you add wear and tear and cost. You take life off the unit. So these big units are designed for base load power generation. They don't have much of a role to play in following load, the daily ups and downs of demand. In Saskatchewan, we have a peak at breakfast. We have a little bit bigger peak in demand at lunchtime, and the largest peak is from 4 to 8 o'clock at night. So big nuclear power plants don't really have a role to play in addressing those peaks and valleys of demand, and the even more strenuous requirement to follow the intermittent load of solar and wind, which are which move up and down sometimes instantaneously from zero to a lot and then back to zero. That they're also not they're not designed for that. But the small reactor designs that we're looking at are designed so that they can have the capability of following loads, and some designs are built such that that they could follow load almost as well as a natural gas-fired power plant. So one of the evaluation criteria that we use is what's the potential to use this SMR to use SMRs to follow load, the daily ups and downs of our load curve, and also to support the intermittent generation that we have from wind and solar. And that's really important because if you think about it, if the government of Canada is going to achieve this objective that they have set out of net zero from the power grid by 2035, it will require us to use and rely less on natural gas less. And right now, the most economic way to support wind and solar generation, the intermittency of wind and solar, is by using natural gas-fired power generation. So if we're restricted in the amount of natural gas we can use, we have to find some other way of regulating those loads. SMRs, some SMR designs are actually quite well suited to that. One of the things about advanced reactor designs, some advanced reactor designs, is that the high outlet temperatures of the steam it starts to support that kind of, you can dump the energy into energy storage and use it that way. There's also there's the flexibility of the plant design itself, more flexible in large reactors. So it's an important consideration for us as we look to be less reliant on natural gas. The other way that nuclear power, I mentioned this, the other way that nuclear power supports more aggressive deployment of wind and solar, which in Saskatchewan we think is important. We have a very strong wind and solar resource, some of the best solar resources in Canada, some of the best wind resources in Canada, and we want to access them as much as we can. There are technical limits on how much we can bring onto our grid to ensure the reliability of the grid. If we build transmission infrastructure that gives us a stronger connection to Manitoba, to think about it as a bigger pipe, so we can, as we back off on our reliance on natural gas, we can bring in clean energy from outside Saskatchewan, from Manitoba, from the United States. Then we bring our emissions down, and with the deployment of nuclear power allows us to rely less on those imports and open up that big electricity pipe so that we can send more power from wind and solar to other jurisdictions. So nuclear power could take over the baseload generation requirements of natural gas, lighten our reliance on imported power in the longer run, and allow us to develop wind and solar not for consumption in Saskatchewan, where it's limited by our demand and by the stability of the grid, but shipping it out to other jurisdictions. So in the long run, the potential for nuclear is to support more wind and solar and to shift from importing energy from other jurisdictions to exporting it to other jurisdictions. And that's another potential economic benefit for the province.
Yeah, that brings up a good point. Somebody asked a question about, do we know yet about the, you mentioned the competitive cost for power would be one of our analysis or evaluation considerations. Do we know yet approximately what an SMR is expected to cost per megawatt at this point?
The short answer is no. We don't know two very important things. We don't know, we have no way of being able to accurately predict in 2021 what the price of power from a nuclear reactor is going to be in 2033. And that is because the SMR designs that we are evaluating none of them have been deployed in a commercial setting yet. That's one of the reasons why it's really important for an experienced nuclear operator to go first, and that we advance the same design in multiple jurisdictions in Canada to manage that first mover risk, which includes how much does it cost. So by 2026, 2027, 2028, we'll start to have a pretty good sense of what the power from a nuclear reactor, a small modular reactor, is going to cost. The other thing we don't know now, so I guess based on what we do know today, based on the information that we get from developers and the evaluation that we do within SaskPower to estimate the cost of electricity, we think it's reasonable. We think there's a reasonable chance that it could be competitive compared to the alternatives. But the challenge with making that assessment is that we don't know what the alternatives are either. One alternative would be imported power from either the United States or from Manitoba. The challenge with that is we don't have the transmission infrastructure to bring in that much power. And so, there's a lot of things that have to happen for that to be an option, and therefore a lot of things that have to happen before we can estimate what the cost of that power would be. We don't know about the potential for wind and solar supported by energy storage. We don't know about the cost of that. We know today that energy storage is really expensive, but we're of the view that storage costs are gonna go down significantly over the next decade, and we think there's a reasonable chance that we could use energy storage in whatever form it takes, whether it's chemical storage in a battery, compressed air energy storage in a hydro application, for that to be competitive and allow us to balance wind and solar and turn it into a reliable source of electricity. But we just don't know what the price will be. So it's kind of up in the air. In 2021, the best we can say is we think based on the work that we've done, there's a reasonable expectation that it will be competitive with the alternatives. And today, if we had to make a list of those alternatives today, it would be wind and solar with energy storage. What's the cost of that? And then, or imported hydro. What's the cost of that? Imported electricity from other clean sources in the United States. What's the cost of that? Domestic hydro. Could we build new hydro facilities in Saskatchewan? What's the cost of that? What's the time frame for that? These are all questions that we have that we need answers to. It'll take time to get them.
There were two other kind of final things, just to wrap up as it's 10 to noon, that I think might fit into the conversation on the last slide about, what would you want to know more about? And I know our colleagues on the siting, the environmental, the impact assessment, and the regulatory would have further comments to add on this. But, are we looking at things like drought tolerance or impact of drought? Or even wildfire risk, is that part of our siting analysis or analysis? And I think speaking for them, I could say yes, but definitely that's feedback that's the kind of feedback we're looking for when it comes to kind of those gaps. And here's what we're looking for. Here's what we're looking at. What other things do you want us to be considering? So I don't know if Iain or Darcy, our project managers, on the line now as well, if you wanted to follow up or on that drought or wildfire.
I don't know that our siting work focuses on that question. I mean, it's obviously a question of great interest in Saskatchewan. How do we minimize the risk that our transmission system will be the cause of a major fire? And we've seen that happen in other jurisdictions, with catastrophic results. And when we think about siting a nuclear power plant in Saskatchewan, we think about access to transmission, or the SaskPower's plans for where the future transmission will be built, which is a function of where we think future demand will go. But no, not specifically are we thinking about, siting it in a place that's going to minimize wildfire risks. But I think if we talk to our transmission planning folks, that's a consideration that they are look at when they think about how do we develop the power system of the future. That's one of the things that they consider. So we don't do it, but the folks that are responsible for planning our transmission and distribution systems, they are giving that a lot of thought, as every other utility in North America is doing.
Thanks, Iain. So I have just a couple of things I wanted to kind of wrap on. We have a couple more public sessions coming up that we'd really appreciate, your participation or sharing information with some of your colleagues or people in your community that may not be specifically at your tables, but definitely members of the public that we'd love to share some information with as well. So we've got 2 virtual sessions coming up next month, one on the 18th during the day, and then one in the evening at the end of the month on November 30th. And then we'll have a couple more opportunities in January. I'm going to, before we let everybody go here, I'm going to ask Adam to pop up our final poll, the kind of the evaluation poll. We'd love to know if the information we shared today was useful, if it was a good use of your time, if you learned something new, or not. Also, just, you know, again, want to reinforce that we want to hear from you, you know, the most efficient way possible. We'd love to, like I said, to come out and talk with you in person if we could do that. There's also opportunities to reach out to us via email. We now have an e-newsletter. If anybody's interested in signing up to that newsletter, there's the link in the presentation there that we're going to send out to you. So we'll send out a copy of the presentation. We'll send out a summary of the questions and answers. We have a recording as well that we'll send out. So I think with that, because it is now 5 to noon, unless there are other questions, thank you very much, everybody, for answering the poll. I'm very happy to see that nobody disagreed or strongly disagreed. Agree was 59 and strongly agree was 41. So there's room for us to beef up the information to make that strongly agree more solid. So thank you for that feedback. Thank you for all of your great questions. I'm happy to stay a little bit longer till noon if anybody wants to chat privately or come off mute or come on camera. If not, please consider this complete, and thanks again for coming today.
And just as we're waiting for a few last minutes here, I did add the files pod just underneath the chat to the screen. So anyone who is interested in saving a copy of the presentations from today, by all means, download there.
Awesome, thank you. And big thanks to Iain, and big thanks to George Christidis and Ray as well, who I know said he was coming in to be at the opening of the legislature today.